Victoria from Biblio Lifestyle, and you're listening to the Reader's Couch podcast, the show that will help you bridge the gap between living a full and busy life to one where you're reading, learning new things, and having fun. Today on the couch, I'm so excited to welcome author Hannah Kaner to talk about her debut novel, which also happens to be the first book in a fantasy trilogy. In Godkiller, a vengeful assassin seeking revenge on the gods after her family's murder, and a disillusioned knight who wants to save his old friend embark on a perilous journey to save two lives. But on their way, they face demons and a growing civil war. Plus, they uncover a dark secret threatening their world. Now, the thing I loved about Godkiller is it's incredibly action-packed, and it helps that even though this is a fantasy and it's the first book in a trilogy, it comes in under 300 pages. So it's definitely that book you want to read if you're looking for an escape, but you don't want the commitment of those chunkier books. And don't get me wrong, I love those chunky books too, but I'm sure you know what I mean. Now, in this episode, Hannah and I talk about her new book, her inspiration for not only this novel, but the trilogy as well, and she even gives us a preview into book 2, whose title right now is Sunbringer. But that's not all. Hannah also shares some books she's read and loved, and she shared tips for readers currently in a slump and readers struggling to find time to read or just to get back into reading. But before we get to the episode, please take a quick second, if you haven't already, to leave the podcast a 5-star rating and review. Believe me, it really helps the show. It's a great way to show your support, and it's free. So hit those 5 stars. I'll be forever grateful. So thanks in advance. And now on to the episode with author Hannah Kaner. Hi readers, welcome again to the Reader's Couch. I'm your host, Victoria Wood, and here on the couch with me to talk about her debut novel and the start of a new series is author Hannah Kaner. Hannah, welcome to the Reader's Couch.
Hi Victoria, thank you so much for having me.
Yay, I'm thrilled to have you here. Can't wait to talk about your book, but before we get into it, I want to know how you're feeling. I mean, it's your debut, Godkiller, the start of a new trilogy. It's available. Readers can get their hands on a copy now, both in the UK and the US, by the way. How are you feeling? How excited are you?
Oh God, absolutely thrilled. I mean, it's been quite a few months. It came out in the UK in January and the US in September. And it's just come out in Spain and Mexico, I think, today.
Ooh.
So it just feels like this sort of growing, beautiful thing that keeps kind of bringing joy back to me. So I'm just, I love talking about this book. I love talking to readers about this book. And so it's just wonderful. I feel really joyful that it's out in the world. I have a book published in ink and paper.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. I mean, it sounds like the gift that keeps on giving, you know?
Yeah.
So, Hannah, tell us about your book, Godkiller. What's your elevator pitch? And what can readers expect when they pick up a copy?
So, Godkiller is about a woman who kills gods for a living until she finds a god that she cannot kill. A god called Skediketh of White Lies, who's somehow attached himself to a young noble girl on the run. So the three of them set off on a quest, and on the way they run into another wandering hero on a quest of his own. But the secrets that they're all carrying begin to clash and unravel as they go on this quest together to the lost city of the gods. So it is at its heart, it's an adventure story. It's a quest story. It has inspiration from Gawain and the Green Knight or The Hobbit, that sense of traveling through a world and getting to know it, and also getting to know the people who you're traveling with. I wanted to write a bit of a classic fantasy.
And I think you did just that. Let's get into the characters a bit. So I know I'm going to butcher names, so I'm just going to say it here. You know, you read a book, you think this is how it's said, and then you discover it's not. So I didn't get to listen to audio, so this is all from print. But our main character, well, one of them, because we have two, is Kissen. Did I get that right?
You did indeed.
Yay! Win. Okay, so I have one win here. So Kissen is a state-sanctioned killer of gods. Just like you said, title says it, Godkiller. But she is helping a young orphaned girl. Ainara, is that it?
Inara.
Inara, okay. I'm cool with that. So Kissen and Inara. So they're on a pilgrimage, so to say. And also there's a third. There's the god who's attached himself, because Inara is the noble girl. So before we go to the other sets of travelers along the way, I really want to get into these two, Kissen and Inara. Tell us about them as individuals. What's their backstory prior to embarking on this journey?
So Kissen is kind of like the heart of the book, and is the first point of view that we come across. And it's a bit unusual. The book is really short. It's about 300 pages, and I do sort of cram 4 points of view in there, but with the intention of them having different perspectives on the journey and the story. And I love that combination of sort of gruff, wandering warrior and like sort of young, green-eyed like child who's new to the world and has to be protected. And that's kind of the balance that Kissen and Inara strike. Is Kissen hates gods, like has grown up hating them after an incident in her youth. She believes that they abuse their power or will always abuse their power, and that she sort of draws the line in the sand between where gods like cannot overstep, and she's there to meet them with a knife if they do. So she's quite larger than life. She's rude, she's brash, she's a working woman. And Inara has a completely different perspective, because she's grown up essentially hiding a god and harboring it, keeping it secret, which is Skedi, the god of white lies. But when Inara is orphaned and Kissen sees this young girl who was in a horrible situation, Kissen says, I'm not about to allow that to happen. Like, this girl should not be left on her own to fend for herself. I will protect her and figure out how to create another life for her. So the relationship between them is kind of mentor and student. It's kind of sisters. It's kind of like family. And a really strong theme of this book is that family is something that you can create and find and shape for yourself, and that it doesn't always look neat or simple, but it is kind of deeply felt. And I love that gruff warrior with a heart of gold and then a precocious young girl. I just think that is a delightful dynamic to have.
I absolutely loved it, and I saw them as sisters. That's how I read it. And so yes, I love this duo for sure. So the three of them, because Kissen, Inara and Skedi, so they're journeying to this city where the god can be severed from Ainara. However, things change. Now we meet along their journey. Is it Elo?
Mm-hmm, that's correct.
Yay! Okay, another win. And Elo also has a backstory, and he is trying to save his old friend, and he needed to kind of go along on the pilgrimage with Kissen and Ainara. So tell us about Elo, along with his friend, and what happens when they kind of get together.
So Elo was once a sort of a knight of the realm, and he fought in the God War that sort of underpins a lot of the political situation that the story cuts through. So this God War was held in the city that they're traveling to, which is where the gods turned on the humans and everything sort of fell to pieces in the city. So it kind of wanted to base it, in a sense, after the fall of Troy, or an equivalent of after the fall of Troy. Elo has another perspective on gods as well. So he believes that everyone should have freedom of faith to believe what they believe. But after the war, and where gods sort of way overstep the boundaries and their relationship with humans, the king has banned all worship of gods from the land. And Elo essentially has conscientiously stepped back from his life as a knight and as the friend of the king's kind of best friend, and has tried to forge a different life for himself, where he's a baker and he's living quietly. And he's essentially a self-imposed exile within his own country. And so the relationship with the king is incredibly complicated. They fought a war together, and now the king comes to him with a request that sends Elo traveling back to the city that, between them and the gods, they destroyed. And Elo needs to get there in private. He needs to get there in secret, which is why they all join a pilgrimage trail, because that's the sort of I was sort of basing it on pilgrimage trails of the Mediterranean and the cult of the saints and people who trek to Jerusalem or to different kind of religious sites, the Camino Trail, and that they would kind of travel over mountains and forests and rivers. And I like that this was a place that people would come together from different walks of life to journey. And so Ilo joins a pilgrimage that Kissen and Inara and Skedi also join, though Skedi is hidden because he's illegal. But then sort of what's been secrets that have been underpinning the political balance of this country sort of slowly come to light through these characters and through their experience of the world, and over the next two novels. Well, it's not so slowly in the next two novels, but you're kind of revealing a little bit at a time of essentially civil conflict that's been brewing. And with kind of Ilo and Kissen and Inara all have different perspectives on this conflict, and the king does as well. So it's a really interesting dynamic.
Yes, I couldn't agree with you more. And, I really don't want to go into spoiler territory, but let's just say that on this pilgrimage, they undergo an attack, things happen. And I think that's where I'm going to leave it there. I want to get into the characters, though, because your novel, Godkiller, just has an incredibly diverse cast. It's really packed in there. And I'm really curious was this something you intended and wanted to do and represent? Because we have Kissen, who is bisexual, but also is an amputee. Oh. Lots of the secondary characters, they're queer. Also, Ilo has PTSD. I think there's a character, if my memory serves me right, who is deaf, and someone else I think uses a wheelchair. And the diversity is broad. I think Ilo, I thought, was Black. You can correct me. But it's just, I love the idea of just a diverse cast of folks going on this pilgrimage, but also existing in this world. So forgive my rambling, but was this intentional? And if so, why was this important to you?
This is a really always an interesting question that I get, because I suppose the answer is yes and no. I did intentionally write a queer norm world, so where people's gender or sexuality isn't really sort of front page news. It's not particularly, it doesn't really matter either way. And I wanted to write a world like that, partly because so often when I was reading growing up, if you were a woman in a fantasy novel or you were a queer person in a fantasy novel, you were often isolated or ostracized or individualized. And that's just not my experience of the world. And as you read kind of more into sort of Renaissance, Mediterranean, medieval histories, that there has never been a sort of very simple set of fixed gender roles that have always been that way. And though I think kind of books that do explore these dynamics of different gender roles and sort of the ostracism of queerness are really interesting and really valuable and sort of representative of different aspects of history, I don't think it's always that's the story that people want to tell. And that's not the story I wanted to tell here. And I wanted to kind of create a world where it's not who you are that makes the difference of how people treat you or how people treat each other, but more what you choose to believe and who you choose to believe that makes that difference. And it meant that I could explore that in more depth without kind of foregrounding sort of conflict between genders or different sexualities, which kind of becomes wearying when it's everywhere. And as a queer person myself, I want to read a diverse range of stories where I hear from diverse different perspectives. So I would say the queer norm aspect of the world was intentional. When it came to representation of disabilities, when I was writing the kind of the introductory scene, the prologue, where Kissen essentially has to escape from gods, and I was establishing the lore of the gods and what would be good, like a strong sacrifice to a god. So prayers, weavings, coins, tapestries, those kinds of offerings, incense, candles, your classic shrine offerings made sense as sort of a common thing that people would give. But something that was more powerful would be something that you really didn't want to lose, so hair or blood, and even more powerful than that would be flesh and bone. And so I wanted to kind of establish that if you wanted a really big gift from a god, you have to offer a really big gift in return. And to escape from the situation she is in the prologue, Kissen is trapped and her father offers her leg to a god in order to save her from from burning alive, essentially. And so understanding as I was writing this and sort of exploring this different lore, I understood that I was going to be writing a disabled character and that it was my responsibility to do that well, and to do that with knowledge. I'm not disabled myself. So I began to read around. I read what disabled readers were saying about their experiences of fantasy. I was reading about people who were amputees and using prostheses. And then I also worked with authenticity editors on Kissen's experience, and on Elo's experience as well. Being he is a Black character with PTSD from fighting in a war. And so the range of disabled communities is because the same experience or similar experience that I had, like growing up and not reading myself in stories as a woman or a queer woman, a lot of the disabled reading community were saying the same thing. And they were saying, we're either alone or we're not represented well, or we're isolated, or figures of tragedy, or figures of abuse. And that's because such a range of disabled communities, that's just not what those communities are. They seek each other out. They find people who understand them, people who work with them and love them as they are and as who they are. And it was important for me to do that respectfully in this book. And so I wanted Kissen, if she was a disabled character, to have people she loved and who loved her, and that she wouldn't be alone, that she wouldn't be magically fixed, that she loved herself as she was as an amputee. Elo has a slightly different experience having PTSD. This is set in a kind of a world just off the edge of a war, which is a mass disabling event, and PTSD is a really common result of that, which wasn't really talked about until really the last century in this world. And the world is set in the Mediterranean as well, where there's a huge amount of cross influences of gods, of culture, of cloth, of silk, of spices, of food, and of stories as well. And so because I was setting this in a world with a huge amount of diversity based on our world, which is a huge amount of diversity, it was important to reflect that candidly and reflect that respectfully. And I hope I did my best. Sorry, now I started rambling along.
No, not at all. Not at all. No, I actually loved hearing that, because I agree in the sense that sometimes one character being representative of an entire community, I get that sometimes that exists and it is valuable, but you're absolutely right. We do seek out our people and we create that found family. And I think you did a great job of that in the book, in that same tradition of seeking out our people. And I felt it reading this book. But now that we've kind of talked a bit about the premise of the book, dived into the characters and so on, now I'm going to put you on the spot and ask, who's your favorite character to write or discover as you were going along?
That's like picking my favorite child. Of course, I love all of the characters. Kissen's voice was the strongest, was the first voice. She kind of stamped into my head about, how many years ago would it be now? 6 or 7 years ago, and just would not leave me alone. I think kind of the voices that are harder to discover but are more satisfying to discover are people whose motives aren't kind of quite so clear at first. I actually found Elo, the knight, one of the most compelling to continue exploring and finding who he was, what his motives were, like, because he's a lot more contained and inwards than Kissen, who's very kind of like outwards and brash. And I loved kind of exploring who he was as a gentle person and as a troubled man, who has a lot of love to give, and just expresses it quite differently from Kissen. And I really enjoyed that character. I enjoyed the dynamic that they had as well, with both very similar pasts, and both different experiences of who they are now. And they kind of grow on each other a lot throughout the book.
Right. Awesome. Love hearing it. So I'm curious, where did this idea, what was the inspiration for Godkiller? But of course, first this book, but then the trilogy at large. What was your thought process? What was the spark that kind of just gave you this idea?
I mean, I feel like a lot of people ask us as writers, what was the big idea for this book? And some people can say I remember exactly the moment when I thought of this book. I do remember the moment I thought of, or remember the first time I started talking about the character of Kissen, the Godkiller. And I think I wanted to write a book with a angry, irreverent, powerful woman at its center. And I wanted her to be funny. I wanted her to be larger than life. And what's more irreverent than killing gods is what I've said before, and I'll say again. We've got a lot of wonderful like Greek and Roman myth retellings. I was massively into mythologies and folklore and stories when I was younger, and the sort of capriciousness of gods is a common factor. And so I wanted someone who could hold those gods to account. And so that I feel was the core, as I said, the heart of the book. But other inspirations that are sort of grown over time, because I think what writers need to do most is listen and be curious, was food and trade culture in the Mediterranean, the cult of the saints, Gawain and the Green Knight, and sort of like old medieval sort of romances or knightly tales. And then other kind of fantasy books like that I've explored similar ideas before. So Terry Pratchett explores kind of like relationships between gods and people, Neil Gaiman as well, Octavia Butler in Parable of the Sower. There's a huge amount of literature that thinks about what are humans in comparison to immortals. And I always think that's a fascinating question. So I wanted to tell a bit of an adventure story that plays on some of these classic tropes of fairy tales and myths and storytelling. And I wanted to write it slightly differently, slightly fresh, with that heart of the Godkiller at its center.
Yay, amazing. So not to jump too much ahead, but it's kind of a known fact. Godkiller is book 1 in a trilogy. And I see on your website that book 2 is listed as Sunbringer. So if you don't mind, could you tell us a bit about it?
So I've described it before as if Godkiller is kind of like A New Hope, then Sunbringer is The Empire Strikes Back. All the conflicts that are brewing in book 1 come right up to a head in book 2. And it's kind of, I wanted to explore some of the extremes of the possibilities of this world, of kind of gods gaining too much power, of humans wanting to gain the power of gods, of the different kind of theologies and theories and experiences people have had in history with their relationship with religion and faith, without diving too far into anything that's based in the real world. So I wanted to kind of just play on those ideas further. I wanted to push the characters to their limits of what they believe and what they do. And in book 3, it kind of comes a little bit back to the quest narrative, but then it also has an element of war and battle. And this is really kind of delightful for me, because I love kind of writing big set piece action scenes. And I also love kind of exploring new parts of the world. So in each book, the world becomes a little bigger and becomes a little bit, just a wee bit more in conflict as well. So yeah, I love taking those threads and weaving them into a bigger tapestry. Book 1 is quite a simple, straightforward quest book, but book 2 and 3 take it a lot further.
So is it fair to assume book 3 is done?
Book 3 is currently being written. Book 2 is very, very much done.
Okay, awesome, cool. So your debut is out, which is Godkiller. Book 2 is done. You just said it, Sunbringer. You're working on book 3. If you could tell your younger self anything, what would it be?
I mean, I started writing at a really weirdly young age. Godkiller was my 7th book that I ever wrote to completion. So, and I've been gone through, as many writers go through, many books that have gone out to agents or gone out to publishers and been turned down or turned back. So I tell myself then tell myself now what I told myself then, which is just keep going, persevere, and write because you love it, because that's kind of all the thing that I've always gone back to. Every rejection, every time a book is turned down, is to say, why am I still doing this? And the answer is always because I love it. And I can't really imagine doing anything else with my spare time. Writing's like breathing to me. And it was when I was a teenager, and it still remains that way, which is really lovely to be able to say. So the advice is just persist, keep going, don't stop.
Love it, love it. Okay, let's get into your reading life, Hannah, because again, we're here to talk about Godkiller, but we want to know what you're reading too. So share with our listeners the last book that you finished reading that you'd now recommend.
Well, I've literally just the other day finished The Oleander Sword by Tasha Suri, which I've been waiting to read it for so long because I absolutely loved the first in the trilogy, The Jasmine Throne. And it's just exquisite writing. It's utterly beautiful. And so I can't wait for the third book in that trilogy. That was my most recent book. Absolutely 100,000% would recommend.
What was your childhood favourite that you can remember?
I loved Dark is Rising by Susan Cooper and the sort of the cycle that followed, which kind of similarly played with gods and folklore and mythology. I love that kind of sense of magic being just under the surface of the world that we lived in.
What would you say is your go-to genre? Like, what genre is never failing that you often return to?
My heart is always going to be fantasy. I love so many different genres. I read as widely as I can, though I've struggled a bit in the last couple of years, but I finally been able to get back into that love of reading. But I will always return to fantasy if I'm at a loss.
So hearing that, you've been in and out of reading, you fell out of love with it for a little. How did you get back into reading? Because I know we have listeners of the show who are either avid readers who sometimes fall into a reading slump, or we have someone who wants to get into reading, but, they just can't find the time, or they just don't think books are for them. What advice would you give to either of these readers, the avid reader in a slump or someone trying to get back into reading or start reading for that matter?
It's something that, I think everyone struggles with, finding the time to really feel fully immersed in a book and to not, to clear out everything else that's on their roster. I think what I always tell myself is try and return to something that brings you the silly joy of reading that you might have had when you were a kid, or that maybe got trained out of you by school or university, where you had to read to elevate yourself and to educate yourself, which is still, valuable reasons to read. But I would always say return to a childhood favorite, even if it's just a little book of fairy stories, or if it's something that you really liked as a 12-year-old and kind of want to go back to. Just remind yourself why you loved it to begin with. I think that joy of reading is really born in childhood, and sometimes is difficult to preserve, that sense of magic. And so I always try and rekindle that magic with something that I once loved.
Yay, I love hearing that. I agree, because that's something I often do. I always say, especially around the holiday time, I'll go back to Letters from Father Christmas and just read a little and then disappear and do what I have to do. But then, it kind of keeps you going. So, yeah.
Sometimes you just need something just a little bit more bite-sized.
Yes, absolutely. Hence those letters. So...
Yeah, one of the things I've loved most about releasing Godkiller is that it's very short for a fantasy book at there's about 100,000 words. Is that quite a few people have messaged me saying that got me back into reading because it felt easier to pick up, like something less, smaller mountain to climb, I guess. And that's made them read other books. And that is like kind of, if my books get you to read other books because you just fall in love with reading all over again, that's just the highest possible compliment. So... yeah, it's been really lovely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree, because it's right under 300 pages. The US edition, I have it right here. Page count is 288. Yep, 288. So you really can sink your teeth into this one. And Hannah would love it if it got you back into reading. So, Hannah, on the show, we're also big supporters of indie bookstores. Tell us about your favorite local or a bookstore you discovered on your travels.
Oh, my favorite local is a bookshop called Argonaut Books. So I live in Edinburgh, and I live in an area called Leith, which is right on the river. And Argonaut, I dark on their doorstep pretty much every other day. They've got really nice tea and coffee, brilliant selection of books, and a really nice kind of community feel. And the area was really lacking a bookshop you could go and hang out in. Like the nearest one was like 20, 30 minutes walk away. And this one's like 10 minutes off my doorstep. I do think booksellers, both in independent and in non-independent bookstores, but have absolutely made Godkiller what it is the passion of booksellers, the way that they have really championed the book and put it in people's hands and brought it into their shops, because especially independents, it's difficult. They need to make a lot of room in sometimes really small spaces for new books. So it's just been absolutely fantastic. And Argonaut in particular have been incredibly supportive.
Love it. That's amazing. So getting back to Godkiller and kind of wrapping things up, again, I know you've done your job. You've written the book. It's been out in the UK since January. Americans have gotten their hands on it September. But what are the reactions you're hoping for, or just the thoughts you're hoping readers might have after they've turned the last page?
I want people to feel, I want people to feel like they've been on an adventure, that they felt immersed in that adventure. I wanted it to be a text at a pace in line with the idea of exploration, and that people could see different parts of a world and sort of see these relationships growing and developing slowly over 300 pages and then end with a big bang. And I just wanted to instill that sense of adventure in people. And that's something that I would love people to find from Godkiller.
And then hopefully pick up book 2 and book 3 when they are ready. Hannah, thank you so much for coming on the show and speaking with me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me, Victoria.
Thank you so much for listening to the Reader's Couch podcast. Please subscribe to the show, share it with a friend, and take a few seconds to leave a rating and review. Until next time, stay lounging, stay reading, and whenever you're in doubt, go straight to your local bookstore or library. Thanks again for listening, and happy reading.